A teller personnel discriminate against a young boy trying to withdraw money, shocked by the arrival of his billionaire dad. Before we go further, please ensure to like, share, and subscribe for more interesting stories like this one. It was a busy weekday morning at Grand Sterling Bank, one of the fanciest banks in Michigan. People dressed in expensive suits walked in and out. Some were talking on phones, others were reading papers or chatting quietly. Everything felt serious and important. The shiny floor reflected bright lights from the ceiling. The air smelled of coffee and new money. Then, something unusual happened. A young boy, about 12 years old, pushed open the heavy glass doors. He walked in slowly, holding a small paper tightly in both hands. He looked out of place. No briefcase. No fancy clothes. Just a clean polo shirt, ironed jeans, and worn-out sneakers. His eyes moved around, a little nervous but focused. He walked up to one of the tellers. A serious-looking man named Mr. Dawson, who sat straight at his counter like he owned the place. The boy stopped in front of him, took a deep breath, and said, "Good morning, sir." Dawson glanced up, clearly surprised to see a child standing at his counter. His eyes moved from the boy's face to his shoes and then to the slip of paper. "What can I do for you?" he asked, not kindly. The boy handed over the slip. "My dad sent me. I'm here to take out some money." Dawson raised an eyebrow. He looked at the amount on the slip, then looked back at the boy. "Really?" he said. "This is a lot of money for a kid. Did your dad give you any ID? A note? A card?" "No, sir," the boy replied. "Just that slip." He signed it. "See at the bottom?" Dawson chuckled and shook his head. "You expect me to just hand over money because you say your dad told you to come? That's not how this works." The boy's cheeks turned red. He looked down for a second, then back up. "My dad said it would be fine. His name is Richard Alford." Dawson paused for a moment. That name was well known in the city. But instead of showing concern, he laughed again. "Of course," he said with a smirk. "And I'm the president." "I'm telling the truth," the boy said, his voice soft but serious. "You can check the account number. It's there." Dawson leaned back in his chair. "I've seen every trick in the book. I'm not falling for a little kid trying to act like a businessman." There were now people lining up behind the boy. Some were trying to ignore the scene. Others watched with quiet interest. The boy stood still, trying hard not to let the embarrassment show on his face. "I'm not lying," he said again. "My dad wants me to learn how to handle things." Dawson picked up the slip again and waved it a little. "Then tell your dad to come in himself next time. You're wasting everyone's time." The boy looked around. No one was helping him. He felt small and alone. But instead of walking away, he stood his ground. "You don't believe me because I'm a kid," he said. "And maybe because of how I look." Dawson raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me." The boy didn't look away. "If I wore a suit and looked like someone from your world, would you still treat me this way?" For a second, Dawson didn't know what to say. The other teller, a young woman nearby, had been watching quietly. Now she looked at Dawson with a frown. She seemed uncomfortable. The boy didn't cry. He didn't yell. He just stood there, quiet but proud, waiting for someone to see past his age and his clothes. And the whole bank seemed to go silent. The morning sun filtered gently through tall, wide windows, casting golden light across the polished floors of the Alford estate. The house was enormous, but it didn't scream luxury, it whispered it. Everything, from the long glass dining table to the neatly stacked books on the side shelves, showed taste over show-off. Art pieces decorated the walls, but none were flashy. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and orange blossoms from the garden outside. In the middle of the quiet, spacious kitchen, 12-year-old Jacob Alford sat at the breakfast table, his bare feet barely brushing the floor. He wore a simple gray t-shirt and soft cotton shorts. Across from him, reading a folded newspaper with half a smile on his face, sat his father, Richard Alford. Richard looked every bit the picture of success. His robe, deep navy with silver lining, fit perfectly over a pressed white shirt. His hair, touched lightly with gray at the temples, was slicked back with ease. Even at the breakfast table, he carried himself like a man who gave speeches to rooms full of people. And yet, with his son, he was just dad. The table was filled with an elegant breakfast spread, scrambled eggs, toast, avocado slices, berries in a crystal bowl, and a steaming mug of chamomile tea for Richard. A helper had already brought Jacob a tall glass of fresh juice and a warm stack of pancakes. The father and son ate without rush, enjoying the peace before the busy day began. "So," Richard said, finally lowering the paper and giving Jacob his full attention. Big plans for today? Jacob looked up, a bit of syrup still on his fork. I was going to finish the second chapter of that finance book you gave me. Richard smiled. Still like it? Jacob nodded. It's kind of fun. Numbers make sense. Good. But reading isn't enough, Richard said, tapping a finger against his mug. You learn faster when you experience things. Jacob tilted his head. Like what? Richard reached into the pocket of his robe and pulled out a folded slip of paper. His son recognized it immediately, a withdrawal form from the bank. Richard unfolded it carefully and signed his name at the bottom with a black pen, then slid it across the table. Jacob looked at it, surprised. What's this for? I want you, Richard said, pausing for effect, to go to the bank today. On your own. Jacob blinked. Really? Yes. Take this slip. Ask for the amount listed. Don't tell them who I am unless they ask. Just go like any other person would. Jacob's eyes widened. He looked down at the paper again. It wasn't a small amount. Won't they ask for ID or something? Maybe, Richard said, taking a sip of his tea. That's part of the experience. I want you to see how people treat you when they don't know your name. How they talk to someone who isn't dressed like a businessman. It's not a test, son. Just a little lesson. Jacob was quiet for a moment. You mean, you want me to feel what it's like to not be rich? In a way, Richard said. You're growing up in a world where things come easier to you than they do for others. That's okay. It's a gift. But gifts come with responsibility. I want you to understand how the world works for most people. How respect isn't always freely given. Sometimes you have to earn it. Jacob folded the slip carefully and put it in his pocket. He wasn't sure whether to feel excited or nervous. What if they don't believe me, he asked. Then stay calm. Stay polite. Ask them to check the account number. My name is on it. If they still say no, come home and tell me what happened. Either way, you'll learn something. Richard leaned back in his chair, proud of the moment. He wasn't just teaching Jacob about money. He was teaching him about the world, its shadows, and its light. You trust me to do this alone? Jacob asked quietly. Of course, his father said. I trust you more than anyone else. There was a long pause, filled only by the quiet ticking of a nearby clock and the chirping of birds just outside the windows. Jacob nodded, now holding the folded slip like a badge of honor. I'll go after breakfast, he said. Richard smiled. Good man. They finished their meal in easy silence. A few minutes later, Jacob ran upstairs to change. He picked a navy polo shirt, some clean jeans, and his favorite sneakers, the ones with a tiny scratch on the heel but still comfortable like old friends. He combed his hair to the side, just like his dad's, and looked at himself in the mirror. He didn't look powerful. He didn't look rich. But he looked ready. As he came back downstairs, he passed by the housekeeper, who smiled and handed him a small pouch with the bank details inside, just in case. He waved goodbye to the staff and walked out the wide wooden front doors, down the long stone steps of the mansion, and toward the waiting car. But then he paused. No driver, he said to the guard. I want to walk. The guard looked confused but nodded. Richard, watching from an upstairs window, gave a knowing smile. Jacob stepped out onto the sunny sidewalk, withdrawal slip tucked carefully in his back pocket, heart beating a little faster with every step. He had no idea what would happen at the bank, but he knew one thing. Whatever it was, it would be worth remembering. The soft hum of the bank lobby buzzed on, but for Jacob, every second felt like a loud crash. The room, full of professional chatter, seemed to narrow in around him, and all eyes were on him now, eyes filled with judgment, skepticism, and whispers. Dawson, the teller, leaned forward, his lips curling into a cold sneer. The calm, polite face he had worn at the start was now gone. His voice, once professional, rose in volume. I'm sorry, he said, his voice sharp now. But I'm not playing games with you, kid. Jacob stood there, his heart pounding, eyes wide. He had never imagined things would go like this. The slip of paper in his pocket now felt like a weight in his chest. You can't just walk in here with no identification and expect me to hand over money. Dawson continued, his voice now unmistakably louder, drawing the attention of more onlookers. This smells like fraud, kid. I don't care who your father is. You're not fooling me. Jacob's throat tightened. The words stung. His mind scrambled, trying to think of what to say. He could feel the heat rising in his face, the humiliation creeping in. He had done everything right. He had followed his father's instructions carefully. He had trusted the process. But now, with every word from Dawson, His world felt like it was crumbling around him. "I'm not lying," Jacob pleaded, his voice cracking just slightly. "I swear it's my dad's account. I can prove it. You can check the number." But Dawson wasn't listening anymore. The man's eyes flicked briefly toward the line of customers behind Jacob, his frown deepening. "This is exactly what happens when kids are given too much freedom," Dawson muttered under his breath, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. His eyes narrowed further. "I'll call security." Jacob's stomach sank, his legs feeling like they might give out from under him. He had never been in trouble before, not like this. He felt small, helpless, and every inch of him screamed to run. But his father's words echoed in his mind. "Stay calm. Stay polite." Without another word, Dawson pulled out his phone, and within seconds, a heavy-set security guard appeared from the side entrance. The guard was a tall man with a dark uniform, his face stern as he walked toward the teller. "Is there a problem here?" the guard asked, his eyes scanning the situation quickly. "Yeah, there is a problem," Dawson said, standing up and gesturing toward Jacob with a flick of his hand. "This kid came in here with no identification, trying to take out a large sum of money from an account he can't prove belongs to him. I'm telling you, this situation reeks of fraud. I want him removed." The guard eyed Jacob, then turned back to Dawson. He looked at the boy, his face unreadable, before glancing down at the withdrawal slip on the counter. The amount was hefty, but not entirely out of the ordinary for some customers. Still, the guard hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do next. He shifted on his feet. I don't know," the guard muttered, his voice uncertain. "I mean, maybe we should just check it out first." "No," Dawson snapped, raising his voice a little too loudly. "This is exactly why we need tighter controls. It's too risky. I don't care who his father is. If we just let anyone walk in and take money like this, what's next?" Jacob's heart raced. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a ton of bricks. He had no idea what to do. Every fiber in him screamed to run, to get away from the embarrassment, the shame. But he held on, as his father had taught him, with every ounce of will he could muster. He had to stay calm. "I'm telling the truth," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. His cheeks were flushed with heat. "My dad is Richard Alford. He sent me. You can call him. You can check. Please. I didn't do anything wrong." But Dawson didn't care. His expression was a mix of suspicion and superiority. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest, standing as though the boy were a criminal. "Call him then. But this is not how things work here." The security guard looked from Dawson to Jacob again, clearly unsure. The situation was delicate. There was a part of him that wanted to trust the boy. But Dawson had been clear, and his own instincts told him something was off. The discomfort on his face grew as he looked at the boy, who was standing there with his hands clutching the counter, his eyes wide and pleading. Behind Jacob, the whispers had started. A woman in a navy suit nudged her companion, and a man in a black blazer whispered into his phone, looking up at Jacob. None of them were speaking directly to him, but they were all watching, each glance heavy with judgment. One of the younger female tellers at the next booth, who had been silently observing the scene, couldn't hold back any longer. Her brow furrowed as she watched the exchange between Dawson and the boy. There was something in her gut that didn't sit right. She noticed how the boy wasn't crying, wasn't panicking like most kids his age might. He stood there, small but composed, trying his best to be heard. Her expression softened, and she leaned toward her colleague. "Hey," she whispered, "I think you might want to double-check the account number. Something about this doesn't feel right." But Dawson, too caught up in his own certainty, waved her off dismissively. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he muttered. The young teller looked down at her screen, but her attention never fully left the scene unfolding before her. Something about the way the boy stood, his eyes pleading yet calm, bothered her. She couldn't shake the feeling that Dawson wasn't giving the kid a fair chance. The guard cleared his throat, still undecided. Finally, he turned to Dawson, eyes narrowing with a bit of doubt. "We should at least confirm the details before jumping to conclusions." But Dawson wasn't having it. "We're done here," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the room. "I've made my decision." Jacob's hands trembled slightly, but he didn't back down. He was beginning to realize this wasn't about the money or his father. It was about being seen. Really seen. And it seemed like nobody wanted to see him. Time seemed to slow. The voices around him blurred into muffled noise as Jacob's mind raced. His heart thudded in his chest like a drumbeat, but everything else faded. It was as if the world had paused, just for a moment, leaving him alone with his thoughts, alone in the storm. He could still hear the sharpness of Dawson's voice, the accusation slicing through the air. Fraud. Lying. No ID. The words stung more than they should have, more than they had any right to. But it wasn't just the words that hurt. It was the way Dawson looked at him, like he was nothing more than a nuisance. A liar. A kid who didn't belong. Jacob's thoughts spiraled back to his father. He could almost feel his dad's strong presence beside him, his calm, confident tone, and the way he carried himself like he knew exactly who he was. Jacob had always admired that. Even as a young child, he looked up to his father, not just because of his wealth or his success, but because of the way Richard seemed to handle everything with ease. There was a quiet power about him, one that Jacob had hoped to inherit, even just a little bit. His mind wandered to mornings like this one, those calm, peaceful breakfasts where it was just the two of them. Jacob remembered sitting at that large table, feeling safe, feeling secure. His father, sipping his tea, never hurried, never flustered. "The world will test you, Jacob," Richard had once said, his voice low and serious, as if preparing him for something greater. "But how you handle it, that's what matters." The words echoed in Jacob's mind now, over and over, like a mantra. His father had never taught him to fight, but he had taught him to stand tall, to remain calm in the face of adversity. Trust yourself. Trust your instincts. And now, in the middle of this chaos, Jacob realized what that meant. He glanced around the room, the whispers growing louder, the eyes of strangers fixed on him. It felt like everyone was watching, judging. His hands trembled slightly, but he quickly clenched them into fists at his sides. "I'm not a liar," he thought. "I didn't do anything wrong." He thought about his father again, about the way Richard had always made him feel like he could take on the world, no matter what. It wasn't about the money. It was about knowing who he was and standing by it, no matter how the world might try to knock him down. Jacob had always admired that strength, that quiet confidence. It was something he'd wanted to feel, too. But now, in this moment, that strength felt so far away. Why won't they believe me? The question kept pounding in his head, but he tried to push it away. He had to focus. He couldn't let Dawson's words get to him. He couldn't let the embarrassment and humiliation consume him. His father had never backed down from a challenge, and neither could he. Jacob's chest tightened, and his breath hitched as his thoughts returned to a moment that felt like a lifetime ago. He was much younger then, maybe 5 or 6, sitting on the edge of his father's desk. Richard had been working, but he paused when Jacob asked him a simple question. "Dad, what if people don't like me?" Richard had leaned back in his chair, his face thoughtful. "You can't control how people see you, Jacob," he had said. "But you control how you see yourself. Never let someone else's opinion of you define who you are." That lesson, that simple truth, had stuck with Jacob his whole life. He repeated it in his mind now, holding on to it like a lifeline in the midst of this storm. "I control how I see myself." The heat in his face flared again, but this time it wasn't from shame. It was from something else, something stronger. He could feel his dad's words inside him, like an anchor keeping him grounded. "Don't back down. Don't let them see you break." He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to center himself. His body felt like it was filled with electricity, the tension building with every second that passed. Dawson's words still echoed in the background, but now they didn't have the same power over him. They were just words. Words from someone who didn't know him. Words from someone who couldn't possibly understand what it was like to be him. Jacob opened his eyes. The security guard was still there, unsure of what to do. The customers were still watching, still whispering. But Jacob had made his decision. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. He wasn't going to let Dawson or anyone else make him feel small. He raised his chin just a little, standing a bit taller. His heart was still racing, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from something else. Something like courage. With quiet dignity, Jacob stepped closer to the counter. He looked Dawson directly in the eye. The older man was still frowning, still clinging to his certainty, but Jacob didn't flinch. "Richard Alford," he said, his voice low but steady. "My father's name is Richard Alford. I swear I'm telling the truth." For a second, the words hung in the air, thick with the weight of everything Jacob was feeling. It was as if he was not only standing up for himself, but for everything his father had taught him. He had to trust himself. He had to trust his instincts. The bank felt quiet now, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Jacob felt his breath slow, his heart steadying. He had said what he needed to say, and for the first time that day, He didn't feel like a child. He didn't feel like a liar. He felt like someone who knew his worth. Someone who had nothing to prove. The glass doors of the bank swung open with a soft whoosh. The sound cut through the murmurs in the lobby, drawing everyone's attention. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the air, but it was enough. Heads turned in unison, as though an invisible force had pulled them toward the doorway. There, standing in the entrance, was Richard Alford, calm, elegant, and commanding. His tailored suit, dark and perfectly fitted, seemed to absorb the light, making him appear larger than life. His movements were smooth, deliberate, like every step was planned with purpose. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. The world, for a moment, seemed to pause around him. Jacob's heart leapt in his chest. He had been waiting for this, but even he couldn't have anticipated how powerful his father's presence would be. In an instant, the tension in the room changed. The whispers quieted. The stares grew bolder. People who had been gossiping just moments ago now stood frozen in place, their eyes fixed on Richard. The father's gaze was steady, unbothered by the eyes upon him. He walked toward the teller's booth, each step measured, his expression one of quiet authority. He didn't look at anyone else. His focus was singular, his target clear. Dawson, the teller, who had been so sure of himself just moments ago, stood rooted to the spot. His face drained of color. His lips parted, as though he was about to speak but couldn't find the words. The noise of the bank seemed to fade entirely, leaving a silence so thick it felt like a blanket smothering the room. Richard stopped just before the booth, his eyes now locked onto Dawson's. Without a hint of anger or haste, he spoke in a voice so calm, it was almost too quiet. But it carried with it the weight of someone who was accustomed to being listened to being obeyed. "Is there a problem with my son withdrawing from my account?" Richard's voice was clear and controlled, a quiet power that left no room for argument. There was no need for shouting, no need for drama. His mere presence, his words, commanded attention. Jacob watched in awe, his breath caught in his throat. He had been caught in a storm of uncertainty just moments before. But now, with his father here, everything seemed to shift. Dawson, the teller, who had been so insistent, seemed like a shadow of his former self. He took a step back, his eyes darting from Richard to Jacob and then back to his screen, as if searching for a way out of the mistake he had made. He opened his mouth but closed it again, too stunned to respond. A few feet away, the bank manager appeared, having sensed the shift in the atmosphere. He hurried toward the booth, his face a mix of confusion and fear. His footsteps echoed loudly, like a ticking clock counting down the seconds of his panic. "I am so sorry, Mr. Alford," the manager stammered, bowing slightly in an attempt to regain control. "This was all a misunderstanding. I assure you, we'll get everything sorted out right away." Richard didn't respond at first, his eyes still on Dawson, who was now shifting nervously behind the counter. The air was thick with the weight of the moment. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for Richard to speak, to give some kind of signal of what would happen next. Finally, Richard turned his head slightly toward the manager. His gaze was cool, but there was no malice in it, only the quiet assurance of someone who had dealt with far bigger problems than this. "I trust we won't have any further misunderstandings, will we?" The manager's face flushed. No, sir. Absolutely not. It's all taken care of. I'll make sure everything is cleared up immediately." His words tumbled out in a rush, desperate to smooth things over. Jacob's eyes flicked from his father to the teller, then back to his father. The tension in his chest, which had been building ever since he'd stepped into the bank, was slowly starting to ease. His father's calm, his quiet strength, had filled the room with an undeniable sense of control. For the first time since the incident began, Jacob felt truly relieved. He hadn't realized just how much he had been holding on to, how much pressure had been building, until it was all released in that one moment. The weight that had been crushing him, the humiliation, the uncertainty, all seemed to melt away. His father's presence was a balm to his nerves. Richard turned toward Jacob, his expression softening. Without saying a word, he placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. The gesture was small, but in that moment, it meant the world to Jacob. It was a sign that everything was going to be all right, that his father, always so sure of himself, was here for him. "You handled that well," Richard murmured, his voice low enough for only Jacob to hear. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a father's pride. "I'm proud of you." Jacob blinked, his throat tightening. It wasn't just relief he felt now, it was something deeper, something stronger. He had learned something today, something about standing his ground, about remaining calm in the face of doubt. And now, standing there with his father's hand on his shoulder, he felt as if he had truly grown. The room slowly began to return to its normal rhythm, but for Jacob, everything felt different. The moment, the humiliation, the tension, it all seemed far away now. With his father beside him, nothing could touch him. He knew that now. As the manager continued to apologize profusely and Dawson stammered an apology of his own, Jacob didn't feel small anymore. He didn't feel humiliated. He felt, finally, like he belonged, like he was exactly where he needed to be. And that, in the end, was all he needed to know. The manager's office was small but immaculate, decorated with sleek furniture and polished wood. Jacob sat beside his father, both of them silently watching as the scene unfolded before them. Dawson, the teller who had caused the chaos, stood at the far side of the room, his posture stiff, his eyes lowered to the ground. His face was pale, and his hands fidgeted nervously at his sides. The manager, a middle-aged man who had been trying to salvage what was left of the situation, was now speaking to Dawson in a low, stern voice. His words were clear, but there was no mistaking the anger simmering beneath the surface. You will be placed under review. We cannot have this kind of behavior at this bank. This situation was handled terribly, and you are responsible. Jacob's fingers nervously tapped against his father's armrest, but he didn't speak. The words weren't aimed at him, yet it felt as though they were. Dawson, who had treated him with so much disdain, was now the one being reprimanded. Still, there was no satisfaction in watching the teller squirm. The whole ordeal had left a bitter taste in his mouth, and no amount of punishment could make up for the way he'd been treated. Richard Alford sat beside him, his expression calm, composed. His fingers were steepled together, his posture as straight as ever. He had not once raised his voice, not once shown the slightest hint of anger. But the power in his silence was palpable, and Jacob could sense the quiet authority his father carried. The manager, sweating under the pressure, turned to Richard. "Mr. Alford, I can't begin to apologize enough for what happened today. Please understand, this is not the way we typically do things here. We will investigate and make sure it never happens again." Richard nodded, his gaze cool and measured. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice steady. "But this isn't just about a single mistake. This is about how you treat your customers. Your assumptions about my son were based entirely on his appearance and age. That's not just poor judgment. That's discriminatory behavior. This is an issue that goes beyond the teller, and it's something your team needs to address. It's not acceptable." Jacob glanced at his father, his heart swelling. Richard didn't mince words. He didn't let the situation slide. He took a stand, not for himself, but for Jacob, for how his son had been treated. It was clear now that this wasn't about the money. It was about something far more important: respect. The manager nodded, clearly humbled, though Jacob could see that the words stung. "You're right, Mr. Alford. We will review our training and ensure that this kind of behavior is never repeated. We value all of our customers, and I'll make sure this is handled appropriately." Jacob couldn't help but feel a rush of pride as he listened to his father. It wasn't the kind of pride that came from getting attention or praise. It was the kind of pride that came from seeing someone stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. His father wasn't just rich or powerful. He was someone who cared about doing things the right way. The manager turned to the counter and pressed a button, signaling to the teller who was handling Jacob's withdrawal. "Please get the boys' money, and let's move this along." As the teller prepared the cash, Richard turned toward Jacob, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "You did well today," he said quietly, his voice full of warmth. "I'm proud of you." Jacob's heart fluttered, but he kept his composure. His father's approval meant more than anything, but in this moment, it wasn't the praise that filled him with strength. It was the realization that he had stood his ground. He had held his own in a situation that should have been humiliating. He hadn't broken, and for that, he felt stronger than he ever had before. The moment was interrupted by a soft voice from the side of the room. It was the young female teller who had been standing quietly at the back. She had watched the entire scene unfold, her eyes never leaving Jacob, and now she spoke up, her voice a little hesitant but firm. "I just wanted to say, I was here earlier. I saw everything, and I just wanted to say that what Mr. Alford's son said was true. He wasn't lying. He wasn't trying to cheat anyone. I don't think that's what happened here at all." Jacob blinked, surprised. The female teller had been quiet throughout the entire ordeal, almost as though she hadn't wanted to get involved. But now, hearing her speak, it felt like a small but significant shift. She was speaking up, not just to defend him, but to acknowledge what had gone wrong. The manager looked at her, his brow furrowed, but there was no anger in his expression, just a kind of recognition. "Thank you, Susan. I'm glad you spoke up." Dawson, however, looked even more uncomfortable now. His eyes were still fixed to the floor, and his hands were clasped tightly together. He said nothing, his silence adding to the weight of his shame. Richard's gaze swept over the room, his eyes briefly resting on the young teller before he looked back at Jacob. "There's always room for growth," he said, his tone thoughtful. "It's good to see that not everyone here shares the same views." The female teller, Susan, nodded, her expression firm now. Jacob could see the beginnings of a change, a quiet rebellion against the old ways, a small but important shift toward fairness. He wondered if, in time, more people would start speaking up, would start noticing the small ways in which others were wronged. Maybe this moment, uncomfortable as it had been, would be the spark of something larger. The manager returned to his desk and handed the money to the teller, who passed it over to Jacob. The transaction was simple, but in that moment, it felt like so much more. The physical exchange of money was nothing compared to the weight of everything that had happened in this room. As Richard stood to leave, he placed his hand on Jacob's shoulder once again. "You handled it well," he repeated, his voice full of warmth and pride. Jacob's chest swelled. He didn't need anything more than that. As they walked out of the office, his father's hand steady on his back, Jacob knew that he had learned something today, not just about standing up for himself, but about the importance of standing up for others, and how sometimes the smallest act of courage can make the biggest difference. The mansion stood tall, an oasis of peace amidst the hustle of the city. Inside, the air was cool and tranquil, the faint scent of fresh flowers drifting through the rooms. But it was outside, on the balcony, where Richard and Jacob found their refuge after the chaos of the day. The evening sun cast a soft, golden glow across the skyline, the city sprawling beneath them in all its busy, shimmering beauty. Jacob leaned on the railing, his gaze distant, his thoughts still lingering on the events at the bank. His father stood beside him, his arms crossed comfortably, his eyes taking in the view. The silence between them wasn't awkward, quite the opposite. It was a quiet understanding, a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. Jacob took a deep breath, finally breaking the silence. "Dad," he said, his voice quiet but thoughtful. "Would you have come if I didn't call?" Richard smiled, a small but knowing smile, one that seemed to carry years of wisdom in its simplicity. He turned his gaze to Jacob, his eyes soft with affection. "I knew you wouldn't need to," he said, his voice steady and calm. "But I was watching. I've always been watching." Jacob blinked, his eyes widening slightly in surprise. "You were watching? You didn't trust me to handle it." "No," Richard replied, his tone gentle but firm. "I trusted you. But sometimes, it's not just about trusting. It's about knowing when to step in, knowing when to give someone space to grow. You handled yourself well today. I wanted to see it for myself." Jacob nodded, absorbing his father's words. He hadn't known it at the time, but his father had been there, quietly observing the whole situation, ready to step in if needed, but trusting Jacob to stand on his own. It was a strange feeling, this mix of pride and responsibility, of knowing that his father believed in him so deeply. They both looked out over the city for a few moments, watching the streets below. The city was alive with movement, but up here, everything felt still and calm, as if they were in a world all their own. The sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the chatter of people, all felt like a faint echo from far away. Jacob turned to his father, his eyes filled with curiosity. "You always seem so calm. You never get upset like the others. How do you do it?" Richard chuckled softly, the sound warm and genuine. He took a slow step toward the small table on the balcony, where 2 glasses of fresh juice waited. He picked up one of the glasses, holding it out toward Jacob. "It's not about never getting upset, Jacob. It's about choosing your battles. Life throws a lot at you. People will try to test you, make you feel small, or make you doubt yourself. But the way you react, the way you hold yourself in those moments, that's what matters." Jacob took the glass, feeling its coolness in his hand. He raised it toward his father in a silent gesture of appreciation. Richard clinked his glass against Jacob's, and they both took a sip. The juice was sweet, refreshing after the long, emotional day. But the sweetness wasn't just in the drink, it was in the moment itself, in the quiet exchange between father and son. The setting sun bathed them both in its soft, fading light. The golden hues wrapped around them, turning the city below into a canvas of colors. Jacob let out a small sigh, his heart lighter now. He hadn't realized how much he had needed this peace, this time to just breathe and reflect. The day had been long and full of tension, but now, here, with his father beside him, everything seemed to make sense. "Do you ever get tired of the world?" Jacob asked, his voice a little hesitant, as if he were afraid of the answer. "Of the way people treat each other? Like today, everything felt so unfair." Richard paused, his expression thoughtful. The sun's rays seemed to shimmer on his face, casting shadows that softened the lines of his features. He looked down at the glass in his hand before responding, his voice low but resolute. "Yes, sometimes. The world isn't always kind, Jacob. People are often driven by their biases, their fears, and their own insecurities. But we don't have to be like that. The challenge isn't in changing others. It's in how we stay true to who we are, how we act with integrity and dignity, even when the world doesn't." Jacob nodded, his gaze moving back to the city below. He had never thought of it that way before. All the times he'd felt small, like today, were moments when the world seemed unfair, when people tried to diminish him. But his father's words resonated deeply. The real challenge wasn't just facing the world. It was facing himself, holding on to his own values no matter what others threw at him. He glanced up at Richard, his father's words ringing in his mind. "But what about when it's hard? When it feels like no one else cares? How do you stay true to yourself then?" Richard turned to Jacob, his eyes filled with understanding. He reached out and placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder. "It's hard. It's always going to be hard at times. But when you live with integrity, when you make choices that reflect who you really are, you don't need to worry about what others think. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Because in the end, you'll know that you did the right thing." The words settled between them like a promise. Jacob let them linger in his mind, feeling their weight and their truth. There would always be moments of doubt, moments when people would try to pull him down or make him question his worth. But if he could carry himself with integrity, if he could stay true to his values, no matter what, he would find peace within himself. The city stretched out before them, its lights beginning to twinkle as the evening settled in. The air was cool now, the warmth of the day giving way to the crispness of the night. Jacob turned to his father, his heart full of a quiet kind of strength. "Thanks, Dad," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "For everything." Richard smiled, his hand still resting on Jacob's shoulder. "You don't need to thank me, Jacob. You've always had it in you. You just needed to see it for yourself." The camera lingered on them for a moment, the father and son standing together, overlooking the city. The soft music began to play, its gentle notes floating in the background, echoing the themes of integrity, dignity, and the quiet fight against bias. The camera pulled away slowly, leaving the image of the two of them standing there, side by side. As the city lights flickered below, the scene faded to black. If you enjoyed this story, ensure to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing, heartfelt stories like this. Also, let us know where you are watching from, and drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. What did you think about Jacob's bravery and Richard's quiet strength? Did the scene at the bank move you? Or did the final moment on the balcony make you reflect? This story reminds us that even in unfair moments, integrity shines through. Tell us your favorite part, and don't forget, your voice matters.